Okay, so let's dive into this pretty wild event that happened just yesterday on March 10th, 2025, out in the North Sea. And, it sounds simple at first, right?
Yeah.
Just two ships colliding. But it's actually a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah.
We're talking about the MV Solong. That's a cargo ship
Yeah.
sailing under the Portuguese flag. It was going from Scotland down to the Netherlands.
Okay.
And it ran smack into the MV Stena Immaculate.
Uh-huh.
Now, the Stena Immaculate is a U.S.-flagged tanker.
Right.
It had just come from Greece and was at anchor just off the eastern coast of England.
Makes sense.
But here's where it gets really interesting. It was carrying a whole lot of jet fuel, like 220,000 barrels of the stuff.
Wow.
And get this. It wasn't just any jet fuel. It was specifically for the U.S. military, part of a program they call the Tanker Security Program.
I see.
So you can already see how this is a lot more than just a fender bender, right? So what we're going to do today is break this whole thing down for you. What exactly happened out there, why it matters so much, and what it could all mean going forward.
Right. I mean, just thinking about it, this isn't just a local shipping accident, is it? You've got the environmental impact to think about, in an area that's already pretty sensitive. And then there's the human cost, not to mention what it means for the U.S. military and how they get their fuel.
Exactly.
A lot to unpack there.
A whole lot. So let's start with the collision itself. It happened on Monday, March 10th, out in the North Sea, not too far from the town of Grimsby on the eastern coast of England.
Okay.
That's about 155 miles north of London, if you're looking at a map.
Got it.
So it's around 9:48 a.m. UK time. The Stena Immaculate, remember she's at anchor, so she's not moving. And then bam, the Solong, which is steaming along, slams right into her.
Huh. Well, that raises a pretty obvious question right off the bat. How does a moving ship hit a stationary one?
Yeah. Exactly. And the immediate aftermath. Chaos. Both ships catch fire. There's a rupture in one of the Stena Immaculate's cargo tanks, and all that jet fuel starts spilling into the sea.
Oh, no.
And if that wasn't bad enough, we're also hearing reports of multiple explosions on board the tanker.
Yikes.
The first videos that came out were pretty dramatic, thick black smoke billowing up from both ships. It's a scary sight.
Yeah. I mean, fires and explosions like that tell you right away that there's some serious damage to both those ships.
Yeah.
And a ruptured tank with all that jet fuel, that's an environmental nightmare waiting to happen.
No kidding. But thankfully, there was a fast and massive response. Lifeboats, Coast Guard aircraft, even commercial ships in the area, everyone rushed to help. At first, we were hearing that all 37 crew members were okay, with just one person needing to go to the hospital.
That's good news, at least.
It was. But then came the bad news. Turns out, one of the crew members from the Solong was missing. They searched all day Monday, but they had to call it off that night. And by Tuesday morning, the UK's transport minister, Mike Kane, had to announce the worst, that the sailor was presumed dead.
That's awful. Really puts a human face on this whole thing.
It does. And it leads us to the next part of this story, the investigations. Aside from the tragedy of that lost life, the police are treating this as a potential crime. The Humberside Police, that's the local force, they've actually arrested someone.
Really?
Yeah, 59-year-old man. They're holding him on suspicion of what they call gross negligence manslaughter.
That's a pretty serious charge.
It is. And it's important to note that this guy wasn't part of the Stena Immaculate crew, and he's not connected to Crowley, the American company running the tanker.
Okay, so they're focusing on the Solong side of things then. Maybe someone made a bad decision that led to the crash.
That's what it looks like.
Yeah.
But there's another investigation going on as well. This one's about safety at sea, and it's being run by the UK Marine Accident Investigation Branch. But because the ships were from different countries, and because of what the tanker was carrying, they're working with the U.S. and Portugal, too. They're going to be looking into everything, from how the ships were navigated to whether all the equipment was working properly.
Those marine safety investigations, they don't mess around. They go deep. And for good reason. It's about figuring out everything that contributed to the accident. Could be human error, could be faulty equipment, could even be the weather. They want to prevent something like this from happening again.
Absolutely. And we're already starting to hear some ideas about what might have gone wrong. For instance, there's this expert, Abdul Khalik. He's from the Maritime Center at Liverpool John Moores University. He's saying it's possible the cargo ship wasn't keeping a proper lookout on their radar. That's like rule number 1 out at sea. You got to know what other ships are around.
Yeah, that's basic stuff.
And then you've got Martin Boyers. He's the chief executive of the Port of Grimsby. He's saying, and I'm quoting here, that with all the technology ships have nowadays, a collision like this seems almost like something that shouldn't happen.
He's got a point. We've got all this fancy radar AIS systems that tell you where everyone is, all designed to avoid exactly this kind of thing. So, yeah, you'd think it wouldn't happen.
Right. We've also heard from the UK Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. His office is saying that they're still gathering all the details. And the Transport Minister, Mike Kane, he's saying that their initial take is that there was no foul play involved. So they think it was an accident, but obviously a very serious one with tragic consequences.
So no one intentionally rammed the tanker, but someone might still have screwed up big time.
Exactly. Okay, now let's talk about the environment. This happened pretty close to where a lot of people fish and where a lot of seabirds live. Greenpeace UK is already sounding the alarm. And you can't blame them. Seeing all that fuel spilling out there, it's got to make you worry about what it's doing to the ocean.
For sure. I mean, the North Sea, it's a delicate ecosystem. Any kind of pollution there is a big deal. But here's the thing. Jet fuel isn't quite the same as, say, crude oil. There are some important differences, and the experts have some interesting things to say about that.
Okay, so what are they saying?
Well, one expert, Mark Hartle from Heriot-Watt University, he's pointing out that jet fuel, it doesn't hang around in the water as long as crude oil does. It evaporates faster.
So that's good, right?
It is, in terms of long-term damage, but here's the catch. Jet fuel is way more toxic to sea creatures than diesel fuel is. So the immediate impact, that's what we're really worried about.
So it might not stick around for years like an oil spill, but it could still do a lot of damage right away.
Right. Another expert, Mark Sefton from Imperial College London, he agrees that jet fuel breaks down faster. And he says warmer water actually speeds up the process. It's like a race between the fuel getting into the water and the natural bacteria breaking it down. He's hoping the bacteria win.
I'm rooting for the bacteria too.
Me too. Then there's Andy Teasdale from the Institute of Marine Science, Engineering, and Technology. He's the most optimistic. He's saying that if most of the jet fuel burns off or evaporates, the environmental impact could actually be pretty minimal.
That'd be great.
It would. But the key word there is if. We just don't know how much will actually burn off or evaporate. There's still a good chance some of it will end up in the water.
Okay, so it's not a sure thing.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And then we've got Alistair Grant from the University of East Anglia. He's saying that jet fuel is something like 50 times more toxic to marine life than diesel. That's pretty scary.
Yeah, that's a serious difference.
It is. It just goes to show that even if it doesn't hang around for a long time, that initial blast of toxicity can be really bad for the ecosystem.
Okay, so what's the latest on the actual spill?
Well, the Coast Guard, they haven't seen any obvious pollution yet, but they're also saying things are changing fast out there, so they're keeping a close eye on it.
So no visible oil slicks or anything, but that doesn't mean the water's clean, right?
Right. There could be dissolved fuel in the water, and that can still harm marine life. They need to keep testing to see what's going on.
Makes sense. There was also a bit of a scare early on. There were rumors that the Solong might have been carrying sodium cyanide. That's really nasty stuff, super toxic.
Yeah, sodium cyanide, that's a whole other level of bad news.
Thankfully, the company that manages the Solong, Ernst Russ AG, they've said that the containers that used to hold sodium cyanide were empty this time. So that's a huge relief.
It is. If that stuff had gotten into the water, it would have been a disaster, not just for the environment, but potentially for people too.
Okay, good to know. We've also heard from a couple of other experts, Tom Webb from the University of Sheffield. He's reminding everyone how important that part of the coastline is,
right,
ecologically speaking. And Alex Lukianov from the University of Reading, he's saying that the overall environmental impact really depends on a bunch of things. How much fuel actually spilled, the weather, what the sea conditions were like. It's complicated.
Yeah, it's never as simple as just one thing. It's a whole web of factors that determine how bad things will be.
All right. Now let's switch gears and talk about the U.S. military side of things.
Okay.
Remember, the Stena Immaculate was carrying all that jet fuel as part of this tanker security program. It was basically a backup fuel supply for the military in case of emergencies. So this isn't just about a shipping accident. It has implications for U.S. national security, too.
It definitely does. That tanker security program, it's all about making sure the U.S. military has the fuel it needs, even if things get really rough out there in the world.
Right. And here's the thing. The Stena Immaculate was one of only 10 tankers in this whole program. So losing even one of them, especially like this, it really cuts into their backup fuel supply. And some are saying this is happening at a time when things are already pretty tense globally.
Yeah, 10 tankers, that's not a lot of redundancy built into the system. You take one out and suddenly the whole thing's a lot more vulnerable. And in a real crisis, that could be a big problem.
Makes you wonder if they'll need to rethink this whole program, maybe add more tankers or something.
I wouldn't be surprised if they do. This incident has definitely exposed a potential weakness in the system. They will want to make sure they're better prepared next time.
Okay, so what's the latest on the two ships themselves?
Well, as of Tuesday, it looks like they've mostly got the fire on the Stena Immaculate under control, although they're being cautious about saying it's completely out.
That's good news.
It is. Less risk of more fuel leaking, and it's safer for them to go in and see how badly damaged the ship is. But yeah, they don't want to celebrate too early in case the fire starts up again.
And the Solong?
That one's still burning, and it's drifted away from the tanker. The UK transport minister's even saying it might sink.
Oh, no.
Yeah, not good. If it sinks, there's a chance more fuel could leak out, and it'll make it a lot harder to salvage the ship.
Not to mention the navigation hazard.
Exactly. They've set up a 1-kilometer exclusion zone around both ships. No one's allowed in there except emergency responders.
All right, got to keep everyone safe. Okay, so the big question everyone's asking is, how did this even happen? Was the Stena Immaculate anchored in the right place? Was the Solong off course? And what about that fog they were talking about? Could that have played a role?
Those are all excellent questions, and those are the things that marine accident investigators are going to try to figure out. They'll look at everything. The Stena Immaculate's position, the Solong's navigation logs, the weather conditions. It's a huge puzzle, and they're going to have to put all the pieces together.
And we know the U.S. Coast Guard is sending their own team of investigators over to the UK to look into this too.
Yeah.
Makes sense, since it was a U.S. ship carrying military cargo.
Absolutely. The U.S. has a big stake in this, both for safety reasons and because of what it means for their tanker security program. It'll be interesting to see what they find out.
Okay, so let's sum this all up. We've got a major collision in the North Sea. One sailor tragically lost his life. The environmental impact is still uncertain, but there's a real danger to marine life from that spilled jet fuel. And this whole thing has exposed a potential weakness in how the U.S. military gets its fuel in emergencies.
And what this really shows us is how interconnected everything is. You've got shipping, you've got the environment, you've got national security, all tied together. And when something goes wrong in one area, it can have ripple effects everywhere else.
It's a real wake-up call. And it leaves us with a lot to think about. If a single accident like this can have such far-reaching consequences, what does that tell us about the systems we rely on? How do we make them more resilient? How do we prevent these kinds of things from happening in the first place?
Big questions. And they're not just for the experts to figure out. We all need to be thinking about this. Because at the end of the day, it affects us all.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's something for all of us to ponder as we move forward.